What's up, night owls? Welcome back to Demon Sleep. Real quick, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. I personally read every single one of them, and honestly, it makes my day seeing you all from around the world. If these dark tailies help you drift off or just escape reality for a bit, smash that like button and subscribe. But only if you think we've earned it. No pressure. Alright, lights off, rain on, blankets up. Let's dive into tonight's nightmare fuel. Story 1. When Sympathy Became a Blade. For 3 straight hours, Grant Vance talked without stopping. Not paused, not stumbled, not even to swallow. His voice flowed smooth and honeyed, the kind of tone built in studios and sharpened by years of speaking into microphones. Warm, patient, gently probing. The voice of a man who wanted you to feel safe enough to unravel. Arthur led him. He sat across the fire with the posture of someone slightly on edge, shoulders tight, eyes flicking toward the tree line, fingers worrying at the fabric of his sleeve. It looked natural, too natural, the kind of nervousness you don't question because it fits so well. But Arthur had practiced that nervousness. Every tremor, every breath that caught halfway, every delayed response. He had rehearsed them so many times they no longer felt like performance. They felt like instinct, like muscle memory, like skin. They were miles deep in Ocala National Forest, far past the friendly trails and wooden signs. Out here, the world thinned. The pines pressed in close, their trunks forming tall, silent corridors. Light leaked through the canopy in a strange green haze, not daylight, not darkness, something in between. The kind of light that makes your thoughts feel watched. Grant had chosen this campsite with deliberate precision. He'd shown Arthur the coordinates earlier, smiling faintly as he explained the significance. 10 years ago, 3 hikers vanished near this exact spot. The last GPS ping placed them within yards of where their tent now stood. It's important to face places like this, Grant had said gently. Arthur had nodded, as if swallowing fear. But the coordinates were wrong. Arthur knew that because he'd memorized the real ones years ago. That was Grant's first mistake. Grant believed he was guiding a fragile man toward confession. He believed the forest itself would apply pressure, the history, the isolation, the weight of suggestion. He had studied environmental psychology. He understood how geography could make guilt bloom. What he didn't understand was that he had been walking into this clearing for a decade. Arthur had been studying him just as carefully. The way Grant built narratives, the way he seeded doubt, the way he used small, staged coincidences to destabilize his subjects. Arthur had watched, listened, learned, and waited. The first night, it began with a branch snapping in the darkness. Too sharp, too well-timed. Grant's head turned with cinematic surprise, his expression shifting with impressive fluidity, alarm tempered by calm reassurance. Probably just wildlife, he'd murmured. Arthur had flinched on cue. Inside, he'd smiled. Grant thought he was orchestrating atmosphere, thought he was nudging Arthur toward some breaking point. But every staged sound, every leading question, every carefully placed silence was being cataloged. Grant kept talking now, circling the same themes. Memory, responsibility, the way guilt can hide inside the body. His words were soft, coaxing, almost paternal. Arthur let his breathing grow uneven. Grant leaned in slightly. There it is, Grant must have thought, the crack. But what Grant mistook for fracture was alignment. Because Arthur hadn't come here to confess. He had come to confirm. Another snap echoed through the trees, this one farther out, not staged, not timed. Grant froze. For the first time all night, the mask slipped just a fraction. His eyes sharpened, calculating. Arthur noticed. Of course he did. You heard that too, Arthur whispered, voice trembling perfectly. Grant nodded slowly, rising halfway from his seat. The forest seemed to inhale. That greenish light had faded into a murky dusk, shadows stretching long between the trunks. The air felt thicker now, less like scenery and more like presence. Grant stepped toward the tree line, scanning. Arthur stayed seated, watching. 10 years ago, 3 hikers had disappeared. What Grant never revealed in his polished retellings was that he had been the last person to interview them for his series, the last voice they recorded, the last coordinates they shared. Arthur had been one of the search volunteers back then. He remembered the real location. He remembered something else too, a detail Grant had never mentioned publicly. A 4th set of footprints. Grant turned back toward the fire. We should stick close tonight, he said, voice slightly thinner than before. Arthur met his gaze and let the nervousness drain away. It was subtle, a straightening of the spine, a stillness settling into his features, the costume sliding off. Grant noticed. Confusion flickered across his face. Arthur. For 3 hours, Grant had believed he was peeling away layers. Now he realized he'd been speaking to someone who wasn't unraveling at all. Someone who had been steady from the beginning. You picked the wrong coordinates, Arthur said quietly. The words didn't tremble. The forest went silent. Grant's expression faltered, searching for footing for narrative control. What are you talking about? Arthur stood. The performance was over. You always use location to pressure people, he continued calmly. But you misremembered, or maybe you assumed no one would check. A pause. You weren't this close to them. Grant's mouth opened, then closed. Another sound rippled through the trees, not a branch this time, something heavier. This wasn't part of anyone's script. Grant's composure fractured fully now. The warmth vanished. The practiced sincerity evaporated. What remained was calculation edged with fear. Arthur watched it all with clinical focus. 10 years of observation, of study, of waiting. Grant had come here to draw out a confession. Instead, he had walked into a mirror. You've been building stories around disappearances for years, Arthur said softly. But stories leave patterns. The underbrush shifted again, closer. For the first time, Grant looked genuinely uncertain. Arthur stepped back toward the firelight, not away from the sound, toward it. Because unlike Grant, he hadn't miscalculated the forest. He knew exactly where they were, and exactly who else might remember. Arthur gave him exactly what the moment required. The sharp inhale, the twitch of the shoulders, the quick glance over his own shoulder, as if something might be standing there. Even the nervous laugh, the one that started in his chest and died halfway out, landed perfectly. He had become very good at being the suspect. Good at looking like a man crumbling under the weight of implication. Good at filling in the blank spaces of someone else's story. Grant needed a villain for his final episode. Arthur had stepped into the outline so convincingly that even he sometimes felt the edges of it pressing in. This was the grand finale. 18 months of investigation, hours of recorded interviews, carefully released teasers hinting at a revelation buried in the woods. Grant had built this like a cathedral, brick by brick, and tonight was the unveiling, the truth exposed. The monster revealed. At least, that was the version playing in Grant's head. Arthur had seen something crack during that first staged scare, the branch snapping too precisely in the dark. When Grant turned with rehearsed alarm, Arthur watched his eyes. Not fear, anticipation, a flicker of satisfaction, quickly masked. The look of a man testing a mechanism and watching it function exactly as designed. In that split second, the warm advocate persona thinned. The gentle voice seeking justice for the lost began to fray at the edges. Beneath it was something colder, someone who didn't just tell stories about pain, someone who engineered it. Grant didn't merely investigate suffering. He curated it. The second night proved it. It began with crying. Soft at first, almost indistinguishable from wind. Then clearer, a woman's voice, raw and pleading, drifting through the trees. Arthur sat upright in his sleeping bag on cue, heart pounding hard enough to feel real. The sound was expertly mixed, layered with forest ambience, subtle echoes, the distant crunch of leaves. It felt spatial, immediate, alive. Grant had hidden a speaker somewhere in the brush. Arthur knew because he had predicted escalation. Grant always escalated, but the precision of the audio, the care, told him this wasn't experimentation. This was practice. Then recognition hit. The pitch, the rhythm of the sob, the way the voice broke on certain syllables. Melissa, Arthur's sister. Grant had taken a birthday video their mother had once shared, a clip of Melissa laughing as she tried to blow out candles, and twisted it. Isolated fragments, slowed them, warped them, turned joy into terror. Her laughter had been reassembled into something that sounded like dying. Arthur rose from the sleeping bag, invisible panic. That part wasn't entirely an act. For a fraction of a second, rage burned hot enough to blind him. Not theatrical anger, not strategic fury, something primal, something protective. He tasted metal at the back of his throat. He forced it into the shape Grant expected: fear. "What is that?" Arthur whispered hoarsely, scanning the dark. Grant burst from his tent with impressive timing, face tight with concern. "You hear it too?" he asked, already stepping toward the sound. Of course he heard it. He had composed it. "Maybe someone's out there," Grant added, voice trembling just enough to sell authenticity. His hand rested briefly on Arthur's shoulder. Reassuring, guiding, controlling. Arthur flinched at the contact, letting his breathing fracture. Inside, he memorized the moment, the calm in Grant's pulse, the steadiness in his grip. Grant wasn't shaken. He was conducting. They moved toward the underbrush together, the crying looping faintly between the trees. Grant suggested splitting up for better coverage, casually, strategically. Arthur shook his head, clinging close as the distressed man would. Grant adjusted. He always adjusted. That was the thing about him. He believed he was improvising. In truth, he was following a pattern he had carved long ago: pressure, isolation, sensory manipulation, emotional destabilization. Break the subject down, capture the collapse, edit it into catharsis. Arthur had studied those patterns for years. But tonight something shifted. Because while Grant believed he was tightening the noose, he didn't realize how much he had exposed. Weaponizing Melissa's voice wasn't just cruelty. It was ownership. Only someone deeply familiar with her case would know which clips to request, which angles to exploit, which details never released publicly. Grant thought he was tormenting a suspect. What he had done was reveal proximity. The crying cut off abruptly. Silence flooded the clearing. Grant paused, frowning at the sudden stop. That wasn't in his script. Arthur noticed. For the first time since arriving, Grant looked uncertain. A faint crunch echoed from somewhere farther out, heavier than footsteps. Deliberate, not electronic, not looped. Grant's composure faltered. Arthur felt his rage cool into clarity. The forest wasn't cooperating anymore. And neither was the story. Grant turned slowly, scanning the dark with eyes that no longer held performance, only calculation sliding toward fear. Arthur let his panic fade just a little. Not enough to alarm him, just enough to shift the balance. Because the man who loved engineering terror had just discovered something unsettling. He wasn't the only one out here who understood how to use it. Grant's palm stayed on Arthur's shoulder as they pushed through the brush. The grip was careful, supportive on the surface, firm underneath, the kind of touch that says, "I've got you," while quietly steering you exactly where you're meant to go. His flashlight sliced through the dark, beam steady, deliberate. "There," Grant said softly. The speaker sat wedged between exposed roots, half hidden in leaves. The crying had already stopped, leaving the forest in a thick, ringing silence. Grant crouched first. His face performed the sequence flawlessly: shock, confusion, then protective concern. The transitions were seamless, like muscle memory. "What the hell?" he muttered. "Someone must be messing with us." Anger colored his tone, but not too much. Just enough to suggest violation, just enough to imply danger. Arthur watched him. Grant believed this was the turning point. The moment the walls would close in. The implication was clear: someone else knew, someone else was watching. Secrets don't stay buried. Confess now, before it gets worse. That was the design. But something inside Arthur didn't crack. It hardened. Hearing Melissa's voice twisted into bait had stripped away the last fragile layer of uncertainty he'd carried. Whatever faint hope he'd allowed, that Grant was misguided, obsessive, reckless but well-intentioned, dissolved completely. This wasn't a man chasing truth. This was a man staging it. A man who had learned that cruelty could be applauded if packaged as justice. That voyeurism could be praised if labeled advocacy. That torment, edited correctly, became storytelling. Grant wasn't hunting monsters. He was feeding on them. Arthur lifted his eyes to meet his. For the first time since they arrived, there was no tremor in his gaze, no darting glances, no shrinking posture. Just stillness. 5 seconds passed. No wind, no insects, no sound but their breathing. In that narrow corridor of silence, Grant noticed. Something had shifted. The calculation in his eyes sharpened. His hand tightened slightly on Arthur's shoulder. The reassuring pressure edged into something else: containment. He was reassessing. If psychological pressure failed, what then? Arthur felt the shift in weight, the subtle change in grip. Grant was deciding whether to push harder, whether to corner him physically, whether escalation was necessary. The script was slipping, and Grant did not like losing control of his narrative. Then Arthur smiled. It was small, almost invisible in the spill of the flashlight's outer glow. Not a grin, not mockery. Recognition. He gently stepped out from under Grant's hand and walked back toward the clearing, found a fallen log near the dead fire, sat down, folded his hands in his lap. The posture was calm, patient, like someone waiting to be called into an office. The nervous persona vanished completely. No stammer, no shallow breathing, no restless shifting. Just composure. Grant remained standing for a moment, the flashlight beam lowering slowly. This wasn't guilt. This wasn't denial. This wasn't fear. He cycled through interpretations, trying to fit Arthur's stillness into one of his known categories: breakdown, dissociation, shock. But none of them matched. Arthur looked prepared. Grant stepped closer, studying him. "Arthur," he said carefully, testing the name as if it might trigger something. "You don't seem surprised." Arthur tilted his head slightly. "I'm not," he replied. No tremor, no hesitation. Grant's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was running through possibilities now, recalibrating his approach in real time. Was this defiance, a new tactic, a delayed reaction? Or had he misread the entire arc? The flashlight beam trembled slightly as Grant adjusted his grip. For months, he had shaped this narrative, planting seeds, releasing hints, guiding listeners toward the inevitable reveal. Arthur was supposed to unravel under the weight of implication. Instead, he was sitting like a man who had already reached the end of the story. Grant's voice lowered. "If you know something," he said, abandoning warmth for something sharper, "this is the time." There it was. Not concern. Not empathy. Demand. Arthur looked past him briefly, into the darkness beyond the trees. Then back. "You really think this is how truth works?" he asked quietly. Grant didn't answer. Because for the first time since the investigation began, he wasn't certain which role he was playing anymore. The forest pressed in around them, and the episode he had planned so meticulously was no longer following its script. The crying started again. Same pitch, same cadence, same break in the voice. And then the faintest hitch. A seam. The loop resetting. Grant had been so focused on Arthur that he'd forgotten to stop the track. The illusion cracked in the repetition, the mechanism exposed by its own rhythm. Arthur heard it. So did Grant. That was the moment Arthur began to speak. His voice came out clean, steady. The stammer he had worn for a decade vanished as if it had never existed. "You picked the wrong place," he said calmly. Grant didn't respond. "The real site isn't here," Arthur continued. "It's 47 miles northeast, high water table, sandy subsoil, terrible for preserving remains." The forest felt smaller. "You wouldn't know that from the public reports," Arthur added. "Those details were sealed." Grant's posture changed, subtle but unmistakable. His weight shifted back. His shoulders angled slightly. His right hand drifted closer to his jacket pocket. Arthur noticed everything. "I know because I read the forensic summary," Arthur said. "The unedited one." Silence pressed in again, thicker than before. Grant's face emptied of performance. No empathy, no outrage, no protective concern, just calculation, cold and rapid. How does he know that? Who told him? What does he have? Arthur rose slowly from the log, movements deliberate, palms visible in the beam of the flashlight. "I built someone for you," he said. "Arthur Reeves, the perfect suspect, the demographic fit, the psychological profile, the nervous habits your audience would recognize instantly." Grant's eyes narrowed. Arthur reached inside his jacket. Grant's hand snapped fully to the gun. But Arthur withdrew something else first. A badge, metal catching the light. "I'm not Reeves," he said quietly. "My name is Arthur Lowry." The name hovered between them. Melissa Lowry was my sister. Grant's expression shifted, not to remorse, not to fear. To math. Arthur could almost see the equations running behind his eyes. Is the badge real? Is this federal? Is there backup? Is this a bluff? Grant had crossed certain lines long ago. Once you step over them, violence becomes less a last resort and more a contingency plan. He had brought the gun for this exact possibility. The possibility that manipulation might fail. His fingers closed around the grip. Arthur saw the decision land before the movement happened. Grant chose certainty. The forest exploded with the crack of a gunshot. Grant's laugh came with it, short, sharp, empty. Not humor, not hysteria. Recognition. He had been outplayed, but he refused to lose. The muzzle flash lit the trees in violent white. And then, nothing. No collapse. No body hitting the ground. Grant blinked. Arthur was still standing. Because the shot hadn't been aimed at him. It had angled instinctively toward the sound behind them. The heavy, deliberate movement that had been circling since the speaker fell silent. Grant hadn't fired at Arthur. He had fired at the dark. Another shape moved between the trees. And in that flicker of confusion, in that single fractured second where predator instinct overrode calculation, Arthur stepped forward. Not as the suspect, not as the performance, but as the man who had spent 10 years waiting for Grant to reveal exactly who he was when cornered. The gun wavered in Grant's hand now, because the narrative was gone. And without it, he was just a man in the woods with a weapon and no control over the ending. The flash swallowed the forest. White total, blinding. The gunshot didn't sound like noise. It felt like a punch delivered by the air itself. A shockwave slammed into Arthur's chest, folding the world inward. His ears collapsed into a high, metallic ringing, as if rain had begun inside his skull. Then came the impact. Not pain. Not yet. Pressure. A crushing, concentrated force drove straight into his sternum, like a hammer swung with every law of physics behind it. The Kevlar stopped the bullet, but stopping is not the same as sparing. The energy spread through his ribs in a violent bloom. And Arthur left the ground. Air exploded from his lungs in a single guttural gasp as his body flew backward. He hit hard, spine striking packed earth, the back of his head snapping against dirt and stone. His vision fractured at the edges into crawling static. The forest smelled different now. Burnt powder, hot metal, the sharpness of something chemical layered over pine and damp soil. His diaphragm spasmed uselessly. No air. 3 seconds. 4. 5. A primitive certainty rose in him. This is death. The vest failed. Something ruptured. Blood filling a cavity he couldn't see. His heart slowing under invisible pressure. The pain arrived next. Deep structural. Not the clean sting of a cut, but the sensation of a building collapsing inward. His rib cage felt compressed, then confused, as though it couldn't remember its original shape. Every attempt to breathe sent fresh waves of agony radiating from the impact point. The edges of his vision grayed. His body began to dim the lights, preparing to shut down. Then, his lungs unlocked. Air tore back into him with a raw, dragging sound like drowning in reverse. Oxygen flooded his bloodstream, and with it came clarity. He wasn't dying. The vest had done its job. The pain was real, blinding, overwhelming, but it was pain, not failure. Arthur rolled onto his side, coughing, forcing his arms beneath him. Every nerve screamed in protest. His chest felt like shattered glass held together by fabric and willpower. Up it. He had to get up. Standing took longer than he'd imagined. His legs trembled violently. Twice, he nearly collapsed back into the dirt. Blackness pressed at the edges of his sight with each movement. The 10 seconds it took to reach his feet stretched into something unreal, as if he were watching himself from above, issuing commands to a damaged machine. Rise. Balance. Stay upright. When he finally stood, the motion was stiff, mechanical, jerking through its sequence. Grant was still there, still holding the gun. But something had changed. The confidence was gone. He had expected a body on the ground. Instead, Arthur stood before him, swaying slightly, chest heaving but upright. Alive. Grant's expression flickered disbelief first, then recalculation, then something thinner. Fear. Arthur took one shallow breath, then another, fighting the fire in his ribs. You brought it, he managed, voice rough but steadying. So you always planned for this. Grant didn't answer. His gun wavered just slightly. The forest had gone utterly silent, as if even the insects were waiting to see what happened next. For the first time since they stepped into these woods, Grant wasn't directing the scene. He had fired. He had escalated. And the man he meant to erase was still standing in front of him. Grant's gun remained raised, but the certainty behind it was dissolving. Arthur was still standing. Not just standing, rising fully now, steadying himself and smiling. It wasn't the anxious half-smile Grant had studied for months, not the careful expression of a man cornered by implication. This smile was older, patient. It had been waiting long before the stammer, before the badge, before the forest. Arthur's hands moved to his jacket zipper. Grant's weapon tracked the motion instantly, barrel aligning with center mass again. But he didn't fire, because confusion had crept in. He was trying to understand, trying to force what he was seeing into a structure that made sense. The suspect had been shot. The suspect should be down. The suspect should be afraid. Instead, Arthur unzipped the jacket slowly. The credentials slipped from his fingers and fell into the dirt between them. Face up. Grant's eyes dropped for half a second. Long enough. The badge was wrong, the lamination slightly uneven, the hologram too vivid, too blue, cheap craftsmanship masquerading as authority. Not federal, not official, a prime. Grant looked back up sharply. Under the jacket was Kevlar, yes, but also something else. A wire, thin, black, running from beneath the vest down to a compact transmitter clipped securely at Arthur's hip, positioned off-center, away from where the bullet had struck. Grant's breath caught. The device was simple, no flashy hardware, no elaborate casing. Just a button. Arthur's chest throbbed violently with each heartbeat. Heat radiated outward from the impact point, blooming into a bruise that would darken by morning. Pain pulsed through his ribs like a warning drum. But he didn't look away. He held Grant's gaze. You build theaters, Arthur said quietly. Grant's face changed. The warmth, the practiced concern, the righteous anger. Gone. What remained was something stripped of pretense, not monstrous, not theatrical, just empty, the absence of whatever should have been there. He understood now. This wasn't a confrontation. It was containment. The stage he had constructed for Arthur, the coordinates, the speakers, the emotional traps, had itself been placed inside a larger design. And he had never seen the edges of it. Arthur's thumb hovered over the transmitter. For 18 months, he continued, voice steady despite the fire in his chest, you thought you were guiding me here. Grant's grip tightened. Arthur pressed the button. The forest erupted. Sound burst from every direction at once. Not a single speaker. Dozens. Voices poured out of the trees in a synchronized wave, layered, overlapping, surrounding. The perimeter had been invisible until this moment. Grant spun instinctively, gun jerking from left to right. Speakers hidden in branches, camouflaged at the base of trunks, tucked into underbrush. Weatherproof units designed for hunters and campers, built to survive rain and heat and months of silence. Arthur had placed them one at a time. 6 months. Different trailheads, different routes, never the same pattern twice. 3 square miles of overlapping audio zones. The voices weren't random. They were familiar. Names, dates, case numbers, fragments of recordings, clips from interviews Grant had conducted over the years, moments he thought were private, unedited exchanges before the microphone officially started. In each one, the mask slipped just slightly. A tone too sharp, a question too leading, a pause held too long. Evidence. Grant's breathing accelerated. He turned in a slow circle, trying to locate a source, but there wasn't one. The sound was everywhere. You like pressure, Arthur said over the rising chorus. You believe environment makes people confess. Grant's jaw tightened. His eyes searched the darkness for movement, backup, agents, silhouettes. There were none. Just the speakers. And the recordings. Arthur's chest screamed with every breath, but he stood straighter. You were right, he said softly. Place matters. The grid had been tested dozens of times. Range checked. Batteries rotated. Signals calibrated. People with nothing left to lose had helped. Families. Those who had watched their loved ones reduced to episodes, to cliffhangers, to monetized tragedy. They had learned. Slowly, quietly. Grant lowered the gun slightly, not surrender, not yet, just recalibration. Because this wasn't a bluff. This was documentation. And somewhere beyond the trees, beyond the carefully drawn perimeter, other equipment waited. Recording. Transmitting. Grant finally understood. He hadn't walked into a trap built in a weekend. He had stepped into something constructed, with patience equal to his own. Arthur met his eyes one last time as the forest echoed, with the sound of Grant's own unfiltered voice. You thought you were producing a finale, Arthur said. The speakers swelled. But this is just the raw footage. More voices layered in. Not just one recording. Many. His producer's voice cut through the trees next, calm, technical, focused. They were discussing edits. Not edits for clarity. Edits for impact. How long can we hold on the mother before it feels exploitative? Cut the trembling, Leave just enough. Don't use that take. You can see he's too excited. Grant's own laugh followed. Unfiltered. Unashamed. A confession disguised as crap. The speakers carried every word cleanly across the grid. Months of careful placement made the forest itself a broadcasting chamber. Overlapping signals ensured there was no dead zone, no safe pocket of silence. Grant flinched as though the air had turned solid and struck him. The gun lifted higher, now aimed at Arthur's face. "Turn it off," he demanded. Gone was the warmth. Gone was the empathetic cadence that had convinced millions he cared. His voice flattened into something sharp and metallic. Arthur saw the tremor in his wrist. Small, but undeniable. The first fracture. He said nothing. The pain in his chest sharpened his focus to a razor edge. Every pulse of agony reminded him he was still here, still upright, still in control. 10 years. 10 years of studying Grant's patterns. 10 years of reshaping himself into the exact kind of man Grant would find irresistible as a suspect. 10 years of waiting for him to escalate, because escalation was inevitable. Predators always escalate. From the speakers, another clip rolled. Grant describing the crime scene where Melissa died. Not the public version. The private one. The way he lingered. The way he said he felt something electric standing where her body had been found. The way grief, when performed correctly, became compelling. He had called the families exquisite. Said they moved exactly where he nudged them. Puppets. Grant's breathing grew shallow. His eyes scanned the tree line, calculating distances, angles, escape routes. Arthur could see him running scenarios. Shoot Arthur. Smash the nearest speakers. Silence enough of them before anyone arrived. But there was no visible operator. No footsteps. No headlights cutting through the woods. The families had been careful. Too careful. They were not charging in. They were waiting. Grant felt it now. Not sound. Presence. The instinct prey animals feel when something watches from the dark. His head turned left. Right. Back again. And in that slow rotation, understanding dawned. The architecture was bigger than he'd imagined. Even if he pulled the trigger again, even if he killed Arthur here, the recordings would continue. The grid would hold. The transmission would not stop because the signal did not depend on Arthur's heartbeat. The button had only started it. Grant's producer's voice returned, clinical and detached. "We'll frame it as advocacy," she said in the recording. "People don't question advocacy." Grant's own response followed. "They don't want truth," he'd said casually. "They want catharsis." The forest carried his words back to him from every direction. Grant's gun wavered. Arthur watched the realization settle like frost. Violence couldn't fix this. There was no single throat to silence. No single device to smash. The theater he had built to expose others had become a stage for his own unedited performance, and the audience extended far beyond these trees. Grant's jaw tightened. For the first time, he looked small. Not physically, narratively. The story was no longer his. And the gun in his hand, once the ultimate assertion of control, had become meaningless against a machine already set in motion. Steady rhythm of boots over earth. Not rushing, not frantic, certain, Grant rolled onto his back, sucking air, eyes wide to the low canopy where branches webbed against a dimming sky. For the first time, there was no sound from the speakers, no layered confession, no engineered chorus. Only the forest, only the footsteps. They closed in without hurry, the kind of pace taken by people who know the terrain, who know exactly where it narrows, where it dips, where the ground softens underfoot. Grant pushed himself up, scrambling for the gun. His fingers brushed leaves, mud, stone. Not metal. The depression in the land revealed itself gradually, subtle at first, then undeniable. The earth sloped downward in a shallow bowl where water gathered after heavy rains. The soil here was darker, looser. His expensive shoes slid. He staggered upright, turning in a slow circle. Melissa's mother stepped into view first. No dramatic reveal, no shouted accusation. She simply walked out from between two trees, as though emerging from her own backyard. Her face held nothing recognizable, not fury, not triumph. Pressure, a decade compressed into something dense and immovable. David Thornwell's father appeared next, rope coiled neatly over one shoulder. His movements were efficient, almost instructional. A man who had spent years teaching others how to survive in places exactly like this. His daughter came behind him, mirroring his steadiness. Rachel's husband last. His expression was blank in a way that felt deliberate, as though he had removed every unnecessary piece of himself before arriving. Grant's breathing quickened. "You don't have to do this," he said automatically. The old tone crept back in, measured, persuasive, reasonable. The voice that had convinced grieving parents to relive their worst days into a microphone. No one answered. Arthur reached the edge of the clearing moments later, slower now. Each step jarred his ribs. He tasted iron at the back of his throat, but forced himself upright against a tree trunk. He would not fall. Not yet. Grant looked from face to face, calculating again. But this equation was different. There was no single mind to manipulate, no producer to charm, no audience to sway. The problem was not Arthur. Arthur had been the door. The problem was collective. Shared memory, shared harm, shared patience. Grant lunged, suddenly toward a gap between Melissa's mother and David's father. He made it 2 steps. The ground betrayed him first. His foot sank into mud where the water table kept the soil soft year-round. His balance shifted just enough. That was all it took. David's father moved with practiced precision, rope uncoiling mid-step. Not chaotic, not emotional. A clean motion learned through repetition. Grant twisted, shouting now not words, just sound. The forest absorbed it. Rachel's husband intercepted the other side, cutting off escape without striking, without rage, simply occupying space with unyielding presence. Melissa's mother stood directly in front of Grant as he struggled, her gaze level. "You said we wanted catharsis," she said quietly. Her voice did not tremble. "You were wrong." The others tightened their formation, not frenzied, not cruel, methodical. Grant's strength burned fast, panic devouring oxygen, muscle coordination failing in uneven ground. He slipped again, knees hitting mud. The rope caught his wrists before he seemed to understand what was happening. Arthur watched through narrowing vision. Not with satisfaction, with completion. The machine had reached its final sequence. No one cheered, no one shouted accusations, The speakers remained silent now, their work finished. The recordings no longer necessary. Grant's earlier words seemed to linger in the damp air regardless. They don't want truth, they want catharsis. He had misunderstood. This was not spectacle. There were no microphones, no edits, no framing, just consequence. Grant's eyes darted to Arthur one last time, searching for leverage, for narrative footing. Arthur met the look steadily. For 10 years he had allowed himself to be shaped into bait, had endured proximity to the man who killed his sister, had listened to the podcast episodes dissect tragedy like case studies. Now there was nothing left to say. The forest felt very old around them, indifferent to story, immune to spin. Grant's voice, so carefully cultivated for an audience, broke into something raw and unfamiliar. For the first time, it sounded like fear without performance. Arthur closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself against the pain in his chest. When he opened them again, the work was nearly done. Would not change the shape of what was happening. Grant's finger tightened on the trigger. No one flinched. No one lunged. They did not rush him. They did not plead. They did not try to talk him down. The silence did what the speakers no longer needed to do. It exposed him. Mud seeped through his jeans, cold and invasive. The smell of iron thickened in his nose. He swung the barrel again, searching for the smallest crack in their formation, the first hint of fear he could leverage. There was none. Arthur stood at the edge of the depression, pale but upright, one hand pressed lightly to his side. His breathing was controlled, deliberate. Pain sharpened him rather than unmaking him. Melissa's mother met the gun with steady eyes. David's father shifted his weight slightly, not retreating, simply adjusting stance on uneven ground. Rachel's husband's expression did not change at all. Grant laughed suddenly, a brittle sound. "You think this makes you better?" he demanded. "You think this is justice?" The word justice sounded foreign in his mouth. Still no answer, because argument was oxygen, and they were not feeding him. His arm began to ache from holding the gun extended. The tremor worsened. 4 rounds. He repeated it in his head like a mantra. 4 rounds meant control. 4 rounds meant choice. But choice required clarity, and clarity was slipping. The mud shifted under him as he tried to plant his feet. Instead of rising, he slid, one knee sinking deeper. The ground here did not offer leverage. It absorbed force. Every motion exhausted him further. "You're murderers," he said, but the accusation lacked conviction. Arthur finally spoke. Not loudly. "You always believed the story was the event," he said. "It never was." Grant's eyes snapped to him. "This is a story," Grant shot back. "You built this, you staged this." Arthur's gaze did not waver. "No," he replied. "We removed your edits." The simplicity of it seemed to land harder than any accusation. Grant's breath hitched. The forest pressed close, indifferent and vast. No sirens, no witnesses beyond the trees, no invisible audience waiting for his narration to guide them. For the first time in his adult life, he could not feel listeners on the other end of his voice. He was speaking into a void. His arm sagged slightly. Melissa's mother stepped forward one pace. "Not enough to threaten. Enough to matter." "You monetized their last moments," she said quietly. "You rehearsed our grief." Each word was placed with care. like stones set in a foundation. Grant's finger flexed on the trigger, but the image of shooting her did not resolve into dominance. It did not reassemble control. It only extended the perimeter of what he could not fix. Because even if he fired, even if he killed one too, the others would remain. And beyond them, the recordings, the backups, the distribution schedule already in motion. He saw it then, not clearly but enough. This was not an ambush. It was a verdict that had taken 10 years to deliberate. His shoulders sagged. The gun wavered. The authority he had worn like tailored clothing hung loose now, ill-fitting. You won't get away with this, he tried, but the threat had no structure. Rachel's husband spoke for the first time. We already didn't. Grant's grip failed. Not dramatically. Not in a cinematic drop. The gun simply slipped from his mud-slick hand and landed beside his knee with a dull, wet thud. No one moved to pick it up. They didn't need to. Grant looked up at them from where he knelt, chest heaving, face streaked with sweat and soil. For years he had described fear into microphones, measured it, analyzed it, packaged it. Now he felt it without distance, without narrative framing, just the raw animal understanding of being smaller than the moment. Arthur stepped closer to the edge of the depression. Every breath cost him, but his voice remained steady. This is the place, he said. Grant's gaze dropped to the mud around him. He understood. Not symbolically, physically. The ground he knelt in was the same ground he had once walked for research, privately cataloging emotional beats. The silence held, and in that silence was something older than revenge. Not spectacle, not performance, consequence. The forest did not care about stories, only about balance. And balance, long delayed, was settling now. Threw on something decided long ago. Not in anger, not in frenzy, but in finality. Arthur lowered the camera. He did not narrate, he did not frame, he did not justify. Grant's last attempt at shaping the moment had dissolved into the mud with the useless weight of the gun. His voice, once an instrument sharpened by repetition, now sounded thin even to himself. David's father adjusted his grip with the calm efficiency of a man tying off a line before nightfall. Melissa's mother did not look away. Rachel's husband's expression did not change. The forest bore silent witness, the air heavy with the scent of wet soil and iron. What they enacted was not spectacle. There were no speeches left, no declarations, no audience to persuade. Only the carrying out of something they had each already accepted in private, years earlier, when the legal avenues narrowed to nothing, and the machinery of narrative turned their loss into commodity. It did not take long. It did not need to. When it was over, they did not linger. They did not stand over him in triumph. They released their grips in the same deliberate order with which they had taken hold. Arthur remained upright only by leaning against the tree behind him. The world at the edges of his vision pulsed gray, but he kept his eyes open. He had needed to see it through. Not for revenge, for completion. Melissa's mother closed her eyes briefly, not in prayer, not in relief, but in acknowledgement of an ending that brought no restoration. There would be no healing here, only cessation. David's father retrieved the disabled gun and cleared it carefully, habit overriding everything else. Rachel's husband stepped back from the depression first. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to articulate. The machine Grant had built of narrative monetization spectacle ended not with exposure, not with viral outrage, but with silence. A silence he could not edit, a silence he could not monetize, a silence that would never trend. Arthur finally slid down the tree trunk to sit on the damp ground, breath shallow, chest burning with each inhale. 10 years. 10 years of patience. 10 years of reshaping himself into bait, into proximity, into access. And now, nothing dramatic. No swelling music. No closing monologue. Just the quiet weight of consequences carried out by ordinary people who had once believed in systems and had waited until waiting hollowed them into something harder. The forest remained unchanged. Branches swayed. Water pooled. The earth absorbed what it always absorbs. And in that indifferent stillness, the story ended without narration. The forest had gone silent. No footsteps, no voices, only the slow, deliberate settling of mud and water over what had been. Arthur stayed at the edge of the hollow, watching the earth swallow the figure that had spent a decade shaping terror, his chest heavy with a bruise that throbbed like a second heartbeat. Around him, the families moved away without a word, dissolving into the darkness, leaving only traces of their presence and the precision of their patience. Their expressions were empty yet complete, faces carved from years of restraint, determination, and quiet rage. Completion, not triumph, hung in the air. Arthur lingered longer than anyone, absorbing the stillness. The body beneath the earth, the silence of the night, the absence of applause, it all pressed against him with the weight of inevitability. He had spent 10 years constructing himself for this moment. Bait, witness, architect of a reckoning. And now, when the theater of vengeance had played to its final note, he realized that what he had achieved was neither release nor satisfaction. It was a process. A hollow mastery over events, a completion without catharsis. Driving south, night bleeding into the edges of dawn, Arthur disposed of the tools, the devices, the traces of his preparation. Phones, laptops, the wire harness, all destroyed or hidden. Each gesture sent sharp jolts through his ribs, reminders that the body carries memory as insistently as the mind. He became once again a man without a narrative, unbound by the story he had just lived. Stories he knew were fragile. They could be rewritten, abandoned, or burned away. Yet he also knew in the marrow of his awareness that this was only another story, another framing to justify the chaos of what he had done. And that truth was simpler, harsher. He had killed a man and felt nothing. Dawn found him at the water's edge, standing where the continent meets the unfeeling ocean. Waves folded and broke without regard, indifferent to human consequence. He pressed a hand to his chest, to the bruise still swelling beneath his skin, and felt the permanence of it. Time would fade its color, but the structural memory remained, a reminder that what survives is not always visible. The ocean receded behind him as he drove north, sun lifting over asphalt and coastline, the horizon indifferent. Horror, he realized, was not in Grant's murders, or in the grotesque currency of tragedy he had built. Horror was in understanding the predator completely, in recognizing the same raw hunger and uncompromising will in himself, channeled differently, filtered through the guise of justice, but identical in essence. The night wrapped around him as he arrived at a nondescript motel, identical to 1,000 others, a place promising sleep it could never deliver. Cash exchanged for a key. A climb to a room smelling of cleaner and stale despair, and he sat at the bed's edge. The bruise had bloomed into a living map of pain, concentric rings pulsing with every heartbeat. He pressed his fingers to it, deeper and harder, welcoming the surge, the shock, the confirmation that sensation at least was still possible. The air conditioner hummed in erratic rhythm, a stuttering mechanical pulse, and for a heartbeat, he thought he heard the faint echo of Grant's cruel recordings, a mocking, impossible loop that no longer existed. He splashed water on his face, met the mirror, and for a fraction of a second the reflection staring back was not his own. It was Grant's, warm, practiced, impossibly controlled, a face that had consumed years of fear and performed it with skill. Arthur blinked. The moment passed, his own face returned, but the revelation endured. He had not defeated Grant. He had absorbed him, internalized the hunger, the discipline, the methodical will to impose one's vision on reality, and dressed it as justice. Lying back on the bed, chest rising and falling, he understood the truth. Vengeance is never a story concluded. It is a current, a weight carried forward, and sometimes the one who delivers it becomes indistinguishable from the one they pursued. Arthur lay motionless, fully clothed, eyes tracing water stains across the ceiling that suggested shapes he could never name, both nothing and everything at once. The bruise on his chest throbbed like a metronome marking the passage of inevitability. Beneath his eyelids, Grant's face lingered, grinning with that hollow emptiness, and Arthur felt it settle deep, rooting itself where the bullet had tried to pierce his heart. He knew with a clarity that was almost unbearable that the forest had followed him. It hadn't stayed behind in Florida. It had burrowed into his chest, into his consciousness, into the rhythm of his life. Every night would bring the same vision, Grant's empty eyes starring, the smile fixed in its void, repeating endlessly in the theater of Arthur's mind. The trap he had set for Grant had ensnared him in return, and unlike Grant, Arthur could not escape. He would replay it over and over, hollowing himself further until the line between hunter and hunted, pursuer and predator, dissolved completely. The air conditioner thrummed irregularly, like a heartbeat out of sync with time. The bruise radiated heat and pain with every inhalation. The imagined crying echoed faintly, threading itself into the hum, as if the world had learned to carry Grant's performance inside Arthur forever. Nothing had been solved. Nothing had been healed. He had merely folded one tragedy into another, multiplied its weight, passed its burden to all who had aided him, leaving them complicit in the endless echo of suffering. Tomorrow he would rise, drive to a nameless town, shed this skin, and step into a provisional identity. Another performance of normalcy awaited, precise, mechanical, inevitable. And he would do it knowing it was nothing but performance, knowing that beneath his shirt the bruise spread inward as well as outward, knowing that everywhere reflective surfaces awaited Grant's smile, ready to mock him. He had become the very thing he had tried to stop, the infection, the malignancy, the puppet. The awareness of the trap had become another layer of the trap itself, another cage of observation and repetition, another level of theater within theater. Meaning had dissolved into mechanical action, a recursive cycle of sight, sensation, and memory that had no resolution. The bruise pulsed, the hum persisted. Grant's empty grin hovered in every shadow, and Arthur Lowry remained, fully awake, fully aware, fully ensnared in the artificial normalcy he had crafted, a life performed entirely within the confines of his own inescapable theater. Arthur's chest ached, but it was nothing compared to the weight pressing down on his mind. He understood now that complicity was the only certainty, that everyone, in some measure, bore it. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred until it vanished entirely, leaving only roles imposed by stories, by perception, by the illusions people told themselves to survive. 10 years of careful planning, of becoming the instrument of justice, had revealed a truth he could not escape. The story he had lived was the same story Grant Vance had spun, only now he occupied both sides of the narrative. Consciousness itself felt like punishment, each thought a witness to horror. Existence was a machine grinding forward, uncaring, unfeeling, indifferent to intent or consequence. The universe reduced everything, pain, joy, life, memory, to the same raw material. Moments of meaning flickered briefly like sparks in the dark, only to be swallowed by the silence that awaited everything, inevitable and absolute, returning all illusions to the void from which they had arisen. And Arthur, alone in the motel room, knew with chilling clarity that he could never outrun it, never rewrite it, never escape the machinery of consequence he had helped set in motion. Story 2, The Thing Living in My Skin. The first thing K.H. Lowe noticed was the light, fluorescent, buzzing just beneath perception, a vibration that felt like it had burrowed into her skull and refused to leave. Every shift of her eyes made the world lag behind, as if her body was obeying its own hidden rhythm. She turned toward the window, and the rain smeared across the glass like wet brushstrokes. Beyond it, the parking lot gleamed with pools of yellow, each a tiny puddle of something she couldn't name, something older than the asphalt, waiting for a night like this to reveal itself. The crash, the moment before the hospital, was a blur. She remembered a phone, Liam's voice, a meeting, then this room, heavy with the tang of disinfectant that barely masked other scents. Decay, failure, the quiet betrayal of bodies to time and circumstance. A nurse had come and gone. A doctor had shone a light into her eyes, asked her questions she could no longer recall, and left her with the soft rhythm of machines tracking every flicker of life. That's when she saw it. Crouched in the corner where ceiling met wall, a shape that should not exist in three-dimensional space. Its limbs bent impossibly, joints where there were no joints, bones where there could not be bones. Its face twisted between rage and desperate pleading, or maybe hunger. But whatever emotion it carried, it demanded acknowledgement. Its mouth opened in a silent scream, and hands, too long, too many-fingered, reached toward her as though it were stealing from her, or offering her something she would never understand. K.H. Lowe blinked, shut her eyes, and when she opened them, it was still there. Now she saw the edges shimmering, layered, like sheets of plastic wrap shifted just slightly, each offset creating a motion that didn't belong in reality. The door opened. Her mother entered, carrying a plastic bag that crinkled in the silence. The creature snapped its attention toward her, and K.H. Lowe's throat seized. It fell, no, cascaded, off the ceiling at angles that defied physics, wrapping around her mother like a garment woven from wrongness itself. Yet her mother moved with delicate purpose, placing the bag on a chair, stepping to K.H. Lowe's side as though nothing unusual were happening. The thing clung, probing, fingers sliding through skin and bone like water flowing beneath a surface. K.H. Lowe tried to warn her, but her voice betrayed her. It emerged distorted, notes almost, but not quite correct, vibrating with the wrong resonance. Her mother's smile touched K.H. Lowe's hand, and the warmth she expected was undercut by a coldness, deeper than the skin, deeper than the thing itself. In that instant, clarity struck. The horror was not upon her mother. It was inside her, or perhaps she was inside it. The entity clawing at her mother was not escaping. It was infiltrating, or maybe the line didn't exist at all. Outside, inside, beginnings and endings folded into one. She didn't speak when the doctor returned, didn't speak when the nurse changed her IV. She only watched. The coroner held a new presence, or perhaps the same one returned, persistent as a shadow refusing to die. K.H. Lowe wondered what had changed inside her. Had the crash rewired her mind? Or had it peeled back the veil from a world that had always existed beneath normal perception? A reality she would now carry like a weight she could never shed. Her gaze drifted to her hands, pale on the hospital blanket. She tried to remember what was normal, what had been simple, the world before the rain, before the crash, before the shapes that had no right to move. But those memories were slipping, fragile as smoke. The thing in the corner pulsed in the shadows, patient, eternal, and K.H. Lowe knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that she would never unsee it, never return to a life untouched by what lurked just beyond comprehension. The room hummed, the rain tapped, and whatever she thought was gone, replaced by the slow, inescapable understanding that the world had always been this way, and she had only just opened her eyes. The moment K.H. Lowe tried to recall the crash, it was as if her memory hit a wall of smoke. She couldn't tell if her hands had gripped the wheel tight, or if she had reached for something that might have saved her. The details dissolved before they formed, leaving nothing but a void, a hollow space where experience should have lived. Surrounding that void were other memories that wobbled under scrutiny, snippets of her past that felt borrowed, like someone else's home movies projected onto her life. Learning to drive, her first day of school, they were facts without texture, dates and names without the small humiliations, the sharp, tactile moments that should have burned themselves into consciousness. When the hospital released her 3 days later, the paperwork was clinical. Instructions for monitoring concussion symptoms, numbers to call if she felt dizzy or nauseated. Nothing prepared her for what she had seen. Nothing mentioned the shadows crawling along walls, the way reality bent in ways it shouldn't. She signed the forms, noticing her own signature looked strange, uneven, unfamiliar, as though her hand remembered the letters but not the rhythm. It felt like imitation, not instinct, like writing learned from copying, not creating. Liam arrived in his car, the familiar tang of air freshener mingling with the lingering scent of old fast food bags he never threw away. He hugged her cautiously, as if she might shatter under the pressure, and for a moment, the lingering vision seemed explainable. Perhaps it had all been a trick of trauma, medication, fears, chemistry, twisting perception into hallucination. Then she saw it. It crouched in the back seat, smaller or perhaps distant, defying logic. Its eyes blazed with a frantic urgency, hands pressed to the seatback not to cling but to warn, to scream without sound. It wanted to communicate a danger she could not yet name. Liam's voice reached her, careful, soothing, asking if she was all right, soft as if walking on ice. She tried to respond, to speak the truth about the thing in his back seat, about the shapes that had been haunting her vision, but her mouth betrayed her. The words that emerged were calm, reassuring, obedient to some other rhythm, some unseen choreography where they should have been alarmed. Her chest tightened. She realized then that seeing wasn't enough, warning wasn't enough. The creatures, the impossible forms, smaller, larger, closer than they should be, existed in a layer beneath the one everyone else inhabited. They were neither hallucination nor hallucinator. They were information, present whether she wanted it or not, demanding acknowledgement. She blinked and the shape shifted, receding into shadows but not disappearing, reminding her that proximity was irrelevant. It would always be there, observing, urging, warning, patient beyond measure. The drive home was quiet. The rain against the windshield became a drumbeat in her skull, a pulse that matched the tremor in her hands. Every rearview glance caught the empty space behind Liam's seat, and yet she knew the eyes were still there, burning with the same desperate need. Her mind teetered on the edge of disbelief and terror, understanding something she could not yet name, that reality had cracks and she could see through them. And in that seeing, she felt both cursed and chosen. K.H. Lowe told herself she was fine. Her voice carried the lie too clearly, a smooth veneer over something raw and unsettled. Liam drove her home, headlights cutting through rain-slick streets that felt familiar and alien at once, as though reality had been swapped for a near-perfect imitation. Every detail seemed right, yet wrong. The angles of lampposts, the space between parked cars, even the quality of light. Her hands hovered over the wheel, expecting a layout from another era, reaching for controls that weren't there. She froze, folded them in her lap, fighting the eerie instinct that her body remembered a world different from the one surrounding her. The driveway stretched longer than memory allowed, and the front door resisted her touch as if testing her return. Inside, her room had not changed. The bed remained unmade, a frozen echo of the night she had vanished into the accident, a night her mind refused to supply. Her laptop, dusted with absence, reflected her in a glass that seemed hesitant, lagging, almost contemplating her image before presenting it. She sank onto the bed, attempting to reconstruct the memory of the highway, the rain, the disorienting shimmer of headlights on wet asphalt. The stretch of road where she had crashed refused to settle in her mind. It shifted with every attempt to recall it. Sometimes she saw construction barriers. Sometimes she saw decades-old signs with unfamiliar fonts. Her phone, did it ring? Had she dialed someone? Even the sequence of events escaped her, moving under her gaze like water slipping through fingers. Then came the sound. At first, ordinary, her mother bustling downstairs, plates, cups, the faint scrape of utensils. But as K.H. Lowe focused, the rhythm felt off, subtle yet impossible. It was too deliberate, too patterned, a vibration beneath the ordinary noises of a home. Her chest tightened, pulse hitching. She realized with a quiet dread that the world she had returned to was not the same one she had left, and that whatever had followed her from that highway, whatever had watched her in the rain, was still here, threading itself through familiar rooms, waiting. The first thing K.H. Lowe noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but a pause stretched thin over the house, like the air itself was holding its breath. Footsteps below were measured, careful, almost rehearsed, as though whoever moved had to think through every motion, every gesture. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavy with the sensation that the world had shifted under her without permission. Her mother was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with hands that were precise yet hesitant, like a pianist who had forgotten a few notes of a familiar song. When she turned toward K.H. Lowe, her smile lagged by a fraction of a heartbeat, a tiny delay that made K.H. Lowe's chest tighten. The words her mother spoke, "Sweetheart, are you feeling better?" sounded rehearsed, as if memorized, practiced in front of some invisible mirror. And then it hit her. She too had been speaking through a filter she hadn't noticed. Words like literally and awkward emerging with a faint delay, as if they needed translation from a vocabulary that wasn't entirely her own. K.H. Lowe nodded, but the motion felt foreign, like a borrowed rhythm her body was learning anew. Dinner passed in the same way, each story from her parents arriving oddly detached. Fallen trees, neighborhood break-ins, retirement celebrated at work. Their voices were familiar, but the cadence was wrong, like listening to a recording played just off speed. Yet in that wrongness, she felt a flicker of warmth, a strange, inexplicable recognition, as if these phrases carried meaning she'd never consciously learned. Later, she stood before the bathroom mirror. For a heartbeat, she did not recognize herself. The face staring back had the sharp lines and hairstyle of a time long past, lipstick in a shade she'd never chosen. Then, as quickly as it came, it melted back into the reflection she knew, or thought she knew. and she realized she might never have truly seen herself at all, only the version her mind expected, a convenient fiction of continuity. That night, as she lay beneath the ceiling's faint shadows, the house whispered. Every creak and groan sounded deliberate, as if walls and floors were rearranging themselves in quiet anticipation. In the corner, perched where the ceiling met the wall, was the figure from the hospital room, or something almost identical. It did not move like a predator, but like a guardian observing a fragile treasure, its elongated limbs curling toward her, gesturing in a language she could not understand. Its presence was patient, insistent, demanding comprehension without violence. Sleep claimed her, but it did not calm the mind. In dreams, the accident replayed itself with terrible clarity. She saw the slick highway, the rain pooling like silver mirrors, the car slipping and spinning as if the road itself had a mind. Time stretched and bent. She floated above her own body, seeing herself pinned against the steering wheel, head twisted at an angle that made her stomach lurch. And beneath the asphalt, she glimpsed shadows of a town long vanished, a crossroads and forgotten cemetery, layers of history pressed beneath the modern road, a memory of the dead waiting under progress, unseen yet insistent. The dream ended not with relief, but a pulse of wrongness, a subtle reminder that the world she had returned to was layered, fragile, and that whatever had reached for her before had not been contained to the hospital room. Whatever it was still watching. It was still waiting. And for K.H. Lowe, the line between what was real and what had always been hidden had begun to blur, leaving her stranded in a space where nothing was familiar, yet everything was quietly, insistently alive. K.H. Lowe woke with a start, chest heaving, the edges of her dream still burning behind her eyes. She could still feel it, the weightless pull of the body she had glimpsed in the wreckage, a girl suspended between life and death, the ghost of possibility hovering where fate had slammed shut the door. She hadn't felt fear, not exactly. It had been a strange gravity, irresistible and sorrowful, a lure toward emptiness she had brushed against and somehow returned from. Her lungs expanded violently, her heart hammering as if reminding her she was alive, painfully, overwhelmingly alive. How long had she been dead, even for a moment? The thought lodged like ice in her throat. Her phone rang before she could answer the question herself. Liam's name blinked across the screen, urgent, trembling. His voice cut through the fog of morning dread. Something was wrong with his dad. Dress quickly. Come now. She moved in the darkness, silent and careful, each step weighted by a suspicion she couldn't shake, that the world she walked in had shifted while she slept. Passing her parents' room, the low murmur of their voices stopped her in her tracks. The cadence was wrong, measured, deliberate, as if they were actors in a scene rehearsed for decades. Her mother spoke in phrases K.H. Lowe had only heard in films set long before she was born, words dipped in an older form of affection. Her father responded with the same odd rhythm, polite, almost quaint, as if trying to imitate themselves. It shouldn't have felt comforting, yet it did. She froze, listening to the unfamiliar familiarity, sensing an alignment she couldn't explain. The past and present seemed to fold into one, and in that fold her unease thinned just a little. 6 blocks away, Liam's house awaited. She walked because driving felt dangerous, her mind and body still untrustworthy after the accident. Reflexes, depth perception, the invisible threads that tethered her to reality, all of it seemed fragile, suspect. The streets were empty, streetlights casting circles of gold that she skirted carefully, stepping into shadows where the light didn't fully reach. The darkness felt protective, like it held secrets she wasn't ready to see. Her mind drifted, half to the accident, half to the lingering echoes of her dream. The girl in the car, the transparent figures that had circled her in the air. The pull she had felt toward them, the seductive emptiness of a body abandoned by its owner. The memory of slipping inside that moment, of feeling her own form restored like a cruel miracle, pressed against her ribs with every step. And yet, beneath it all, a thread of dread tugged at her. What else had she glimpsed that day that her waking mind hadn't yet accounted for? She reached Liam's house, the faint glow of a porch light cutting through the shadows, and knew without being told that whatever awaited inside was not just ordinary crisis. It was threaded with the same wrongness she had been feeling since waking, a subtle, insistent distortion of what should be familiar. And as she lifted her hand to knock, her heart caught, not just from fear, but from recognition. She had stepped into a world that had already moved, reshaped, and was waiting for her to understand how small her grasp on it truly was. K.H. Lowe stepped off the curb and immediately felt the air thicken, heavy with the weight of the unseen. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the street, and in those shadows she glimpsed them, the dead, or something that had once been. They draped themselves across telephone wires like tattered rags, pressed against windows with eyes that seemed to pierce the soul, moved across lawns with limbs bent in ways that shouldn't exist. Most ignored her, focused on the homes they haunted, but a few turned, studying her as though she carried a secret they'd been waiting to reveal. Hunger, recognition, or something darker, condemnation, accusation, the silent insistence that she was refusing to see what had always been there. The porch light of Liam's house burned like a beacon in the creeping gloom. She raised her hand to the doorbell. It rang, sharp and insistent. The door swung open almost instantly. Liam's face registered relief, but beneath it shimmered something else, a flicker of doubt, as if he too could perceive the wrongness crawling along the edges of the world. He didn't speak. He simply stepped aside, guiding her inside with cautious precision. The living room was still, unnervingly so. Liam's father sat in his recliner, eyes fixed on the blank television screen, tracking invisible motion with meticulous attention. His hands rested on the armrests with a stiffness that suggested they had been placed there, not chosen. When he turned toward them, the smile that spread across his face was too perfect, held too long, and the tone of his greeting belonged to an era long vanished. "Good evening. How was your journey?" It was not the warmth of a father meeting his son's companion. It was a performance, a memory enacted by someone who had forgot the truth behind it. K.H. Lowe felt a strange twist coil inside her, not revulsion but recognition. The tilt of his head, the rigid line of his shoulders, the rhythm of his voice, they were familiar though they shouldn't have been. She realized with a shiver that she had always known this cadence, though she had never lived it. When he offered drinks with the antiquated phrasing, "Care for a phosphate," her lips wanted to move in answer, drawn to a language she had never spoken but somehow understood instinctively. Liam's voice wavered as he spoke his father's name, seeking confirmation, but the man in the chair only repeated it back, wider smile intact, mechanically acknowledging the connection. The gestures, the words, the familiarity, they were stripped of history, of accumulated moments that made relationships real. This was mimicry, a ghostly reenactment of life, and K.H. Lowe felt a cold certainty creep through her chest. She was witnessing the same wrongness she had seen everywhere else, a corruption beneath the surface of the ordinary. And then she saw it, a subtle tremor in his hand, a flicker in the corner of his eye, something he hadn't rehearsed, something alive, urgent, human, trying to pierce the rigid facade. Her breath caught. She realized the performance was not perfect. There were fractures, and within those fractures the truth waited, waiting for someone brave enough to see it. She watched Liam struggle to maintain composure. watched his father's smile falter in tiny increments, and knew that what she had stepped into was not just a home, not just a family, but a liminal space where reality bent, where time and expectation tangled into a dangerous, fragile dance. Somewhere in that tension, the creatures outside, the wrongness threading through the world, seemed to pulse, aware that she had finally noticed. Khlo sank onto the sofa, unwilling to move, unable to look away. The shadows shifted in corners, creeping along walls like silent witnesses. Every heartbeat amplified the strangeness around her. She understood with a clarity that was both terrifying and undeniable that nothing in this house, or outside it, was as it should be. And in that realization, a new fear took hold. She could not look away, could not unsee what had always been waiting for her eyes to open. Khlo's stomach tightened the moment she noticed it. The subtle wrongness in Liam's father, the way he moved and spoke as if he were a puppet rehearsing life. The face he wore was correct in shape, in outline, but it lacked the small, intimate details that made a person who they were. The lift of an eyebrow, the tilt of a smile, the tiny hesitations that were his alone. Something else lived beneath that familiar exterior, or perhaps inside it, or threaded through it. A presence that had borrowed the body without perfect precision. It regarded her with a sharp, unsettling curiosity, and she felt deep in her chest that it knew that she too was an outsider in the flesh she inhabited. For a breathless moment, a horrifying thought struck. Had Liam called her here not to seek help for his father, but to confirm what he already feared about her? He told her it had begun that afternoon. His father returned from work altered, lost simple routines, forgetting where the mugs were, fumbling with the TV remote as if it were a telephone. His speech had become oddly archaic, words and inflections as if lifted straight from a book published in 1955. The number echoed inside Khlo like a bell striking steel, reverberating through her chest and spine. She knew instinctively that the wrongness she'd sensed for days had found a name, a moment of origin she could almost touch. "I think we should go somewhere private," she said. They moved to Liam's room and closed the door behind them. Liam sat on the edge of his bed, hands trembling, breath shallow and fast. She perched beside him, searching for words that could make any of this intelligible, words that might bend reality into a shape they could accept without screaming. She told him everything she could. The figures she'd been seeing since leaving the hospital, how they clung to people like shadows of decay, reaching for faces with too many joints, too many intentions, how the living seemed to bend under their presence. She described her parents, their movements delayed, their speech oddly formal, and the sensation of being surrounded by wrongness that no one else acknowledged. She stopped short of the worst, the dreams, the crossroads beneath the asphalt, the suspended moment above her own broken body, and the terrible, seductive pull of what she had almost become. That secret she kept to herself. Liam's eyes widened, a flicker of both fear and grim understanding. He nodded, confirming what she'd silently suspected. He had seen it too. Wrongness had been creeping through the edges of their reality, small, subtle at first, and he had waited for someone else to name it, so he wouldn't have to be the first to admit the world was unmooring. They stayed awake until the dark hours waned, piecing together their observations. They noticed a pattern among the replaced. The borrowed bodies moved with hesitant precision, spoke with clipped, stilted cadences, as though each action required calculation. Expressions were half-learned, gestures awkwardly rehearsed. They were alive, yes, but alive in a way that belonged somewhere else, somewhere apart from the people they were replacing. Every tick of the clock, every creak of the house seemed amplified in the silence around them. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, thick with unseen watchers. Inside, two teenagers were plotting a fragile map of impossibility, connecting the dots between the living and the replaced, and wondering how long it would be before the world itself decided they, too, could be claimed. The world had shifted, and Chloe could feel it in every step she took. People around her moved as if they were rehearsing life, fumbling with phones like they'd never seen one before, speaking in words that felt like echoes from another time. By dawn, she and Liam had pieced together a truth that was both terrifying and impossible. These weren't ghosts. They weren't echoes. They were taking up residence. The dead weren't lingering, they were moving in. They sought bodies that had been weakened by grief, trauma, or absence, slipping into the vacant spaces left behind. The original inhabitants weren't just overlooked, they were replaced. Chloe's mind drifted back to the accident, the 3 missing days, the moment when her body had been unguarded. Had something pressed against her then, reached inside and claimed what should have been hers? She turned her hands over in the dim morning light, inspecting the lines, the scars, the tiny imperfections, and wondered if they were hers at all. Something felt wrong. Over the next few days, the invasion became undeniable. Mrs. Gable down the street wore her deceased husband's cardigan, speaking in the peculiar cadence that had defined him. The mailman delivered letters along streets that hadn't existed in decades, following a path from a time the neighborhood had long forgotten. At the grocery store, a teenage boy moved like someone whose hands had been crippled for years, reaching for produce with a precision that felt alien to youth. The living were becoming strangers, their bodies inhabited by something else. The replaced weren't always visible, and yet their presence was everywhere, learning the gestures, the habits, the rituals of life, slowly mastering a world that had continued without them. Chloe and Liam tried to warn the people around them, but their words twisted into incoherence, sounding like the ramblings of traumatized minds rather than urgent alerts. Nobody listened, and the replacements moved freely, practicing the motions of life while hiding the void inside them. And in that quiet, horrifying clarity, Chloe understood. The dead weren't just returning, they were here to stay. They were learning to walk among the living, learning to mimic, learning to pretend, while the original souls were forgotten, scattered, or worse, trapped somewhere they could no longer reach. The world looked the same, and yet nothing was the same at all. And she knew with a sinking certainty that there was no turning back from seeing the truth. The first time she saw it, Chloe felt a cold spike run through her chest, as though the world itself had exhaled, holding something terrible just out of sight. It was following her, silently, patient but relentless, a shape at the edge of vision that didn't belong to this world. Her parents, whatever had taken them, had suggested she speak to someone, a professional, as if her mind had fractured from the accident. She nodded, agreed, but deep down she knew that no appointment could prepare her for what she was seeing. Outside, the city hummed with normality, but Chloe's eyes told a different story. Shadows stretched and curled unnaturally. Figures pressed against windows, their movements jerky, limbs bent in ways human bodies weren't meant to bend. People walked down the street, laughing, talking, scrolling on their phones, completely unaware that something cold and desperate clung to them, waiting not to invade but to return, to reclaim what had once been theirs. And as she stared closer, the realization struck her like a hand around her throat. They weren't attacking, they were trying to get back in. The sensation was dizzying, unbearable. These weren't invaders. They were exiled souls clawing toward flesh that felt familiar enough to draw them like moths to a faint, painful memory. Yet even that explanation was incomplete. The truth hovered on the edge of her understanding, sharp and jagged, refusing to be fully grasped. One followed her more closely than the others. It was younger, or had been once, before whatever cruel twist of death had reshaped it. Its face was a study in agony, a silent scream froze in mid-formation, eyes wide and burning with the terror of a life ended too soon. It moved in her periphery constantly, sometimes closer, sometimes retreating, but always patient, always deliberate. Occasionally, it forced itself into her path, walking. Through it was like wadding through invisible cobwebs that tangled not just around her limbs, but inside her chest, tugging at something essential, something she couldn't name. Each step she took felt precarious. She could sense it reaching inward, probing the hollows of her chest like a hand seeking the heartbeat of her very self. The first time it brushed against her, panic spiked violently, but the second and the third revealed a darker truth. It wasn't trying to harm her. It was trying to reclaim a space she had always occupied, a presence that had somehow been open to it in the chaos of the accident. Her mind reeled. Could this be happening to everyone? Was the world around her filled with people wearing borrowed bodies, walking with strangers inside them? She looked at a man on the street crossing her path, felt the brush of something she couldn't see, and knew that yes, the pattern was everywhere. The dead, or what remained of them, weren't haunting. They were returning, patient, methodical, and quietly desperate to find what had been taken from them. Chloe kept moving, heart hammering, chest tight with the unnameable pressure of awareness. She wasn't sure if she was running from them or towards something. And in that liminal space, she felt the world bending, stretching, folding in on itself. The line between life and death, between self and intruder, fraying with every step she took. Every shadow held a hand. Every reflection hinted at eyes that were not her own. And yet she could not look away. Because to look away was to risk forgetting the terrible truth. That some part of her, essential and irreplaceable, was what they were reaching for. And perhaps, if she failed to guard it, they would take it and leave nothing of Chloe behind. Chloe could feel it in her bones, the sense that something inside her chest was being tugged at, probed, and tested. Not just her chest, but the very essence of herself, the part of her that had always been hers alone. She told Liam about it, about the shape that followed her through shadowed streets, the one that seemed to know her movements before she made them. And Liam told her what had latched onto him, a frail old woman, translucent, her spotted fingers reaching for his face in ways that made the skin crawl, trying to claim the contours of his life. They were being hunted, stalked by something that should have remained buried, by the dead who wanted more than presence. They wanted ownership, warmth, solidity, the right to touch, to inhabit a world they no longer had access to. Liam had been digging, desperate, pulling threads from forgotten forums, digital archives, obscure academic texts that whispered of the unnatural. He found references to something he called eviction, a term that made Chloe's stomach twist into ice. The dead, he explained, could force the living out of their own bodies if the living's hold had been weakened by trauma, grief, or moments of vulnerability. Eviction. To be expelled from your own home, exiled from the only skin you had ever known, forced to watch as something else wore it like a borrowed mask. But there was more, a focal point, a rupture, a place where the barrier between life and death had been torn, where violence and wrongness had carved a passage. And in their town, there was only one spot that fit the pattern. Highway 26, the stretch where Chloe's accident had stolen 3 days from her life, was more than a road. Beneath the asphalt lay a secret long buried, literally. The original town cemetery, relocated decades ago, had never been fully empty. Some graves had been skipped, mislaid, or forgotten entirely. And in 1953, when progress paved the highway over the patchwork of forgotten remains, the living began speeding across the bones of the dead, oblivious to the thin veil separating worlds. One The year clawed its way into Chloe's mind, resurfacing in dreams and flickering memories. It explained the instincts she couldn't name, the archaic phrases that felt natural on her tongue, the comfort she found in words and gestures that predated her birth. Liam whispered that if they could reach that precise stretch of road, trace it, confront it, maybe they could understand, maybe they could find leverage. But neither of them knew if confronting the buried past would protect them, or draw the dead's attention even closer. 2. Every step they took toward the highway felt like stepping through a thin membrane between worlds. The air pulsed with tension, alive with the quiet screams of those displaced, and Chloe realized they weren't just racing to survive. They were walking straight into the heart of something that had been waiting for them, a wound in the earth that would not forgive, and a hunger that had centuries to perfect its patience. The idea of the cemetery hung over Chloe like a storm about to break. Liam had explained that they wouldn't just go to the asphalt above the graves. They had to find the original crossroads, the ghost of the town that had existed before the highway, where the old cemetery had first drawn its boundaries. That was where the breach had opened, and if they were careful, maybe, just maybe, they could seal it. Maybe they could stop the dead from slipping through, or at least slow them down. The thought made her stomach twist. Liam had stumbled over his words, tried to soften the truth, calling it the accident instead of what it really was, her death. The violent jolt that had torn open the thin membrane between life and whatever waited beyond. Chloe didn't need the words spelled out. She understood. She had felt it, the unnatural pull, the sense that the world had been cracked in that moment, and that the pieces hadn't been set right. Some rule, some fundamental boundary had been broken, and now they had to face it. They would go tonight, when the streets were empty and shadows long, to the cemetery where the bodies had been moved. The relocated graves might hold answers, names, dates, the record of what had been disturbed, what had been left behind. But Chloe also knew they might find questions that no one should ever face, truths her mind had been carefully avoiding since waking in that hospital room, when her body felt both like hers and like someone else. That night she dreamt of the cemetery again. She was already there, standing in front of a freshly dug grave that didn't belong. Grass had pushed through the soil as though trying to reclaim time, and the headstone bore her name, date she couldn't make sense of. The day she died was 3 days ago, the day of the accident. But beneath it, partially covered by dirt, was another timeline entirely, 1935 to 1953. She shivered, a cold awareness creeping over her. Her rational mind whispered that it was just a dream, a trick of stress and trauma. But when she woke, the taste of dirt lingered at the back of her throat, stubborn and metallic. She could feel it beneath her fingernails, even though her hands were clean. And buried beneath that sensation was something else, more insidious, a craving she couldn't explain, a phantom desire, sharp and specific, a cigarette of a brand she'd never seen, never known, yet it called to her with an urgency that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely, someone who had waited decades to be remembered. Chloe knew the cemetery wasn't just a place. They were walking into the epicenter of something alive, something patient, something that remembered every violation. And whatever awaited them there, she realized with a cold certainty, would demand more than courage. It would demand a reckoning with a past she had only begun to glimpse, and a confrontation with forces that didn't simply want to touch her. They wanted her very existence. The craving lingered in Chloe's mouth, sharp and impossible, a phantom taste of Lucky Strikes in the green pack, a cigarette that had vanished from the world long before she was born. The day passed like she was trapped behind glass, watching her life unfold in muted colors. She went through the motions, breakfast, polite answers to her parents' questions, pretending nothing had shifted. But all the while, the presence shadowing her grew closer. It stretched toward her in silent desperation, screaming in ways that bypassed sound, conveying a knowledge that chilled her to the bone. This wasn't some random predator. It was something that recognized her, knew her, and was trying to force her to see what she had been blind to. In a sudden impulse, she found herself in front of the bathroom mirror. And there it was, the other face, the woman from the 1950s with her carefully arranged victory rolls and painted lips. But this time, blinking didn't erase it. The face lingered, eyes full of sorrow, staring straight into Chloe's soul, reflecting a mistake too vast to undo. And in that mirrored gaze, Chloe felt herself unravel, drowning in the clarity that this wasn't some separate entity. It was her, the truth of her existence laid bare beneath borrowed flesh. By the time night fell, Liam came for her and the thing had closed the distance. Details emerged she hadn't noticed before. The face wasn't some aged echo. It matched her own, her exact age when it had died. The hair, styled in a cut she didn't remember choosing, fell in the same length she currently wore. The clothes were hers too, the jacket from her closet, the jeans she had worn the night of the crash. It wasn't mimicking her life. It had taken her life, her body, and recreated it in every intimate detail. The drive to the cemetery was quiet, heavy with anticipation. The gate swung open with a sigh, a sound almost human, like the release of a held breath. Between the rows of gravestones, solar lights flickered dimly, barely cutting through a darkness that seemed to thicken, almost tangible, resisting every attempt to illuminate it. The thing that had been trailing Chloe moved with them, and for the first time she realized it wasn't lost. This place resonated with it, each step familiar in a way no street or house had ever been. It glided ahead, a silent guide through the graves, as if it remembered what had been buried here long before she had ever lived. Though whether it was guiding them toward safety or into danger, Chloe couldn't tell. Its frantic motions had settled into a steady, almost deliberate stride, as if the cemetery itself had given it purpose. The winding paths spiraled inward, forcing them deeper into the heart of the graveyard, where the stones were newer, polished granite gleaming sharply under the pale moonlight. One grave stood out, dirt still dark and unsettled, the scent of earth sharp and raw. Chloe's breath caught in her chest. The name engraved on the headstone made her stomach plummet. Chloe Marie Whitfield, 3 days ago. Her heart beat in a deafening silence as Liam muttered something behind her, his words mangled and broken in her ears, fragments of meaning that refused to settle. She stepped closer to the stone, compelled, terrified. In its reflective surface, a face stared back at her, but not her own. The woman from her bathroom mirror with the 1950s hair and lipstick, the one she had thought only existed in dreams, looked at her now from the headstone's polished surface. The truth slammed into her like ice. The body she had been inhabiting wasn't hers. That face in the stone was the real her, and everything she had touched, worn, or lived through had been borrowed. Then it moved, faster than she had ever seen it move. The thing wasn't following anymore. It was pursuing, hunting something that had been taken from it. And Chloe understood, with a terror so precise it stole her voice. The reflection, the face, the body, the stolen life she'd been living belonged to someone else. That was her body, her identity, her rightful place in the world, and someone had claimed it in the instant she had been unconscious. Beneath the highway, beneath the asphalt she had driven over, lay the crossroads of the old cemetery. Time, progress, and indifference had weakened the barrier there for decades. Graves had been paved over, bones displaced, death ignored, erased, but the earth remembered. When the crash had come, it hadn't just killed her temporarily. It had shattered the fragile seal, ripped open a breach, and let the dead surge through, desperate and confused, searching for flesh to reclaim. The first to cross had waited longest, a soul trapped since 1953, haunting the crossroads for 70 years. It had lingered through storms, through cars speeding overhead, through the quiet ache of decades, until the moment Chloe's life collided with that fractured ground. And now it had found her, the one thing that had slipped into its rightful place, and it was coming to reclaim what had been stolen for far too long. She had stepped into a body that wasn't hers, a warm vessel left momentarily unclaimed, and convinced herself it was a gift, a second chance, a lifeline snatched from the jaws of death. But the truth had never been negotiable. Flesh is never empty. It only waits patient for its rightful owner to return. The ghost from 1953 stared down at her hands, fingers trembling, suddenly foreign in their own skin. Every line, every scar, every callus was borrowed, a temporary lease she tricked herself into believing was permanent. Memories that had felt familiar were not hers. They were echoes, stolen fragments she had thought made her alive, when really they were just data she had slipped into, reading them as if they belonged to her. And then the real K.H. Lowe reached back. Her hands, ethereal but unyielding, clawed for the body that was hers. Chloe felt the first wrenching pull, a tug at the core of her existence, a violent claim on the warmth and solidity she had dared to inhabit. Liam's voice shattered the moment, a mix of fear and disbelief, but not at the ghost, at her. His eyes widened as he saw what had always been there but now could no longer be ignored. This wasn't Chloe, never had been. The ghost's fingers sank deeper, threading into something fundamental, something electric, fragile, essential. It wasn't just flesh being reclaimed. It was the very architecture of life, the pattern of consciousness itself. Pain tore through the body, but it was more than physical, more than bone or muscle. It was the sensation of being unmade from the inside out, every borrowed thread of thought and memory unraveling. She felt the stolen experiences slipping away, one by one dissolving into nothingness. Her borrowed life, painstakingly stitched together over decades, crumbled like ashes scattered by a storm. She was 70 years of absence pressed into a single, impossible instant, and now that absence was being corrected. The cemetery's air seemed to thrum, charged with the inevitability of restitution, with the weight of decades of wrongs being set right. Chloe's form convulsed, the body shivering under forces it had never known. She wanted to cling, to scream, to insist, but the claim was absolute. The rightful occupant, the original, the girl who had died at that crossroads, pulled the essence back, reclaiming what had always belonged to her. Every heartbeat, every thought, every sensation that had been Chloe's flowed away, leaving the imposter hollow, unanchored, dissolving into the cold night air like smoke. And then, with a final wrenching tug, it was over. The 1953 ghost was gone, swept out of the stolen body, leaving only the real K.H. Lowe standing in the graveyard's center, gasping, trembling, whole again. The breach beneath the highway remained, but at this moment order had returned and the dead had taken back what was theirs. The stolen life, the illusions, the borrowed years, they were gone. What remained was undeniable, the living reclaimed and the truth finally seen. Every fragment she'd held onto, every memory, every warmth, every stolen piece of life, was slipping away like mist burned off by the sun. The kiss she'd shared with Liam, imagined or real, peeled from her mind like old wallpaper, leaving her unable to tell whether it had ever been hers at all. Her mother's hand, the soft comfort of familiarity, dissolved into abstraction, reduced to an idea with no texture, no heat, no pulse. She wasn't merely being expelled from the body. She was being unmade, stripped down to the emptiness she'd carried for 70 years, the incorporeal void that had been her home long before she had dared to borrow this life. Every moment she had claimed, the hospital, the drive with Liam, the dinners, the frantic theories about the town, was erased, revealed for what it had always been. A theft, a temporary inhabitation, a borrowed shadow of reality. The body she had worn recognized its true owner, rejecting her like a living thing repelling a parasite. The sensation was agonizing, as if she were being inverted from the inside out, exposed in dimensions that had no physical form, touching spaces and nerves that had no flesh to contain them. Around her, the others gathered. The ones she had feared, who had haunted her periphery, were no longer threats, they were warnings. They were the evicted, spirits shoved from their own vessels by opportunists, casualties of the same kind of theft she had committed. Their silent screaming, their clawing fingers, their desperate gestures, all of it had been an attempt to make her see before the real owner returned. And now, the one that had followed her relentlessly for 3 days, the one whose features mirrored her own, surged forward with violent purpose. This was K.H. Lowe, her soul, her essence, returning with the force of someone who had watched her life stolen, who had clawed and scraped for what was hers. Every reach, every silent wail, every desperate motion pressed into her chest like fire, a reminder that this body was not hers to hold. The world tilted around her, gravity and thought twisting into the terror of recognition. She was nothing here, just a ghost forced from borrowed skin, forced to witness the reclamation of life she could never possess. And yet, even as she was expelled, even as the memories and sensations were torn from her, she felt a strange clarity. This was justice, inevitability, the natural order correcting itself. The real K.H. Lowe was home again, and the thief, the ghost who had lived 70 years in another time, in stolen warmth and stolen sensation, was nothing more than a whisper, fading into the incorporeal void, empty at last, powerless, unseen, and forever returned to the nothingness she had never left. She hovered there, invisible, powerless, a hollow whisper of what she had been, spiraling in panic as the world she had stolen from reassembled itself without her. The real K.H. Lowe's hand shot out one last time, and with a shuddering pull, the connection snapped. Consciousness tore free from the borrowed flesh like a taut cord snapping, and the imposter felt herself ripped from the body she had claimed. K.H. Lowe watched helplessly as the true owner collapsed into her own frame, sinking like someone who had been underwater for days, finally breathing in a gasp that carried all the relief, shock, and confusion of being forcibly returned. The body, long denied its rightful occupant, recognized her instantly, responded to her presence with a precision and familiarity the imposter had never coaxed out. Every breath, every heartbeat, every shiver spoke of reclamation. Her eyes opened slowly, confusion etched in every line of her face, the bewilderment of a soul evicted from its own home and forced to navigate 3 days in exile. Liam rushed forward, steadying her as the air of the cemetery seemed to hum with release. And the ghost, the intruder from 1953, was cast backward, drawn away from the grave bearing her name, from the flesh she had never truly inhabited, from the life she had pretended to own. She drifted into emptiness, stripped of all borrowed memories, abandoned to 70 years of death she could not outrun. Every sensation she had claimed, the warmth of skin, the taste of food, the intimacy of laughter, evaporated. She was nothing again, a ghost with no home, no substance, no claim. The real K.H. Lowe would awaken with memories of eviction, the strange and haunting knowledge of 3 days spent as a phantom while another lived her life. She would carry traces of it, the disorienting sensation of hands that weren't hers, the unsettling impression of being on the outside looking in. Mirrors would betray her for moments, her own reflection suspect, her body partially unfamiliar. The intruder had left her mark, an invisible scar in the continuity of life. The imposter stared at what remained of her hands, fading, insubstantial, a memory of a grasp that no longer existed. She tried to summon the feel of weight, warmth, and touch, but even that dissolved, leaving nothing but the void of 70 years of true death. Around her, the other displaced spirits, the evicted, turned their gaze away. She no longer threatened the living. She had returned to her rightful place, powerless, incorporeal, forever outside the cycle of warmth and flesh. All across the town, the reversal was unfolding. Every body that had been borrowed returned to its rightful owner. Every stolen life rejoined its consciousness. The balance was restoring itself. And the ghost from 1953, she was left with nothing but the endless, hollow eternity of the dead. Everything snapped into motion in an instant, a violent tug at the edges of existence as the stolen life was yanked back to its rightful owner. Ghosts that had lingered too long, that had pressed themselves into stolen flesh, were torn loose and flung back into the endless void where they belonged. The epicenter of all this chaos, the breach born the night she had died, was closing now. The real K.H. Lowe had returned, and with her, the first doorway slammed shut, rippling outward to seal every other crack the dead had slipped through. It was Liam, or K.H. Lowe, who had fixed it. It was the reclamation itself. The body that had been violated was whole again, the wrong undone, the unnatural paths of intrusion collapsing under the weight of justice. The very laws of life and death were reasserting themselves, closing off every dark alleyway that had allowed the departed to wander among the living. Chloe drifted among the tombstones, untethered, weightless, seeking the faint echo of her own resting place, the true grave of the girl she had once been. She could almost picture it, somewhere far from here in a distant cemetery, tucked away in a town whose name slipped tantalizingly from her memory. Oregon, perhaps, a quiet town lost to time. She knew she would never find it. She knew that decades of progress had likely swallowed it whole. A highway, a parking lot, a shopping center now sitting atop bones long forgotten. The living passed above, oblivious, indifferent, leaving the dead to their vanished history. 70 years had been her prison. 70 years watching the world change around her while she remained frozen in that precise moment, that flash of time when life had abandoned her. She remembered it now, not the borrowed warmth of someone else's memories, but the sharp, crystalline truth of her own death. A girl, a borrowed car, a slippery patch of road, loss of control, a single cruel impact. Her skull striking steel, snapping her neck, instant annihilation. That was her history. That was the exact point she had ceased to be alive and had begun the slow drift through eternity. A ghost without context, a soul without flesh. Then the opportunity had come. Another girl had died in the same place, her body briefly vacant, a heartbeat's window of chance. 70 years of longing surged forward in instinctual hunger. Chloe had moved without hesitation, claiming the warm, fragile shell as her own, oblivious to the consequences, ignorant of the impermanence of vacancy. She had climbed in without a second thought, the desperation of decades overriding any shred of morality. She had assumed it was salvation, a second chance. She had assumed ownership of what could never truly be hers. But patience had never been her strength. For 70 years she had waited in limbo, and when the moment finally arrived, she had seized it, blind to the inevitable reckoning that would follow. The stolen life, the borrowed flesh, the trespass across someone else's history, all of it had been an illusion, a fragile, temporary reprieve. And now, as the world righted itself around her, Chloe floated untethered, watching the laws of the living reclaim their balance, and finally understanding the unbearable weight of 70 years spent in the shadow of what could never be hers. The moment hung heavy, taut with inevitability. Every stolen life was being wrenched back to its rightful vessel, every phantom expelled and flung into the emptiness where it had belonged for decades. The first ghost, the one who had dared to claim what was never hers, was pulled free, and the ripples cascaded outward. Others who had followed her example, believing the breach gave them permission, were yanked from their temporary shelters, the warmth they had seized evaporating in an instant. She had begun it all, and the real K.H. Lowe would bear the echoes of that theft forever. The uneasy wariness in mirrors, the sudden startle at her own hands, the nights waking with the certainty that her own body had betrayed her. The ghost drifted closer to where Liam steadied the real K.H. Lowe, her fingers curling around him with the quiet relief of flesh finally recognized. She wanted to speak, to explain, to say she hadn't intended harm, that 70 years of waiting had made her reckless, desperate. But there was no voice. There were no words for the living to hear. Even if she could apologize, even if she could turn back time, the truth remained. If the chance arose again, she would take it. The alternative, accepting death, was a void too unbearable. The cemetery held its breath as the reversal spread. From town to town, bodies were reclaimed, impostors expelled, and the currents of the dead receding now that the breach had been sealed. The veil between worlds was knitting itself closed, the window for intrusion collapsing. The ghost, her existence unmoored, wandered among the headstones one last time, reading the names, the dates, tracing the young lives stolen too soon. She saw the echoes of herself everywhere. Girls and boys who had died before their stories were finished, whose futures had been stolen by fate or chance. To her, 1953 was still yesterday. The crash, the flash of metal and wet asphalt, the sudden end. All she had ever wanted was to see what came next, to glimpse a world that moved without her, to know if the boy she had been racing toward had waited or gone on. For 3 miraculous days, she had stolen that chance. 3 days of warmth, of sun on her skin, of tasting and touching and listening to a world that had grown and evolved while she had been frozen. Those days had been hers only temporarily, borrowed, illicit, and now they were gone. Her last vision lingered on Liam holding the real K.H. Lowe, steadying her trembling frame, her fingers wrapped around him with the instinctive ease of 18 years, not 3 stolen days. Relief and terror mingled on the girl's face, confusion giving way to the slow, miraculous realization that she was home. The real K.H. Lowe would heal. She would learn trust again, rebuild her memories, reclaim the life interrupted by tragedy. And the ghost, she who had trespassed so recklessly, would return to her rightful place in eternity. The cemetery released her, not into darkness, not into night, but into a boundless absence, a void that stretched endlessly beneath her. She fell without bottom, without warmth, without the hollow comfort of stolen flesh. There was nothing to cling to, nothing to cheat death with. This was her eternity, the inescapable nothing she had fled for 70 years, the state she had tried to outrun with audacity and desire. And as she dissolved, as the last strands of borrowed consciousness unraveled, her final coherent thought was of the real K.H. Lowe. Her name, not the stolen identity, not the phantom name, but her true name, the one from the grave in Oregon that may no longer exist, called across the divide. It rang clear and true, a tether to life she had never deserved, a bell tolling the end of her theft, the final closing of the breach she had created. The last thread of her stolen life snapped, in that infinite silence. The ghost realized that what she had felt as hope had always been fear, fear of losing everything she had never truly earned. Her existence, her borrowed warmth, the life she had trespassed into, dissolved into nothingness. She had taken 3 precious days from someone who deserved them, ignited chaos that rippled through the living, and in the end, discovered she had been the villain all along. Her insubstantial hands, faint echoes of what had once grasped, reached out one final time, aching for flesh they could no longer touch, for warmth they had no claim to, for a life that was never hers. The cemetery closed around her and the void accepted her fully. Darkness, infinite and indifferent, swallowed her whole. Somewhere far from the shadowed headstones, the real K.H. Lowe Whitfield drew a full, unhurried breath for the first time in days. Her heart thudded in her chest with a force that startled her, a proof of her existence, her right to her body, her life. She had been closer to losing herself than anyone should ever be. Every instinct, every memory, every pulse of warmth belonged to her again. The hands clutching Liam's were hers. The air filling her lungs was hers. The fragile, miraculous aliveness of being fully present in her own skin was finally, undeniably hers. She would spend years doubting, checking mirrors, testing her own reflection. But the thief had gone and the barrier had closed. Across the town, life began to normalize. People would forget, rationalize, explain away the impossible 3 days when the dead had walked among them, inhabiting flesh that wasn't theirs. But Chloe and Liam and the others who had survived eviction would remember. They would never forget the terror of being barred from their own bodies, the silent screams of watching someone else live their life, the gnawing uncertainty that the reflection staring back might not be their own. And yet they were alive. They were back. And the ghost, the girl from 1953 who had waited 70 years at a crossroads, desperate and reckless, finally fell. She slipped through the endless dark, past other ghosts who had chased warmth and failed, past those who had clawed at life only to find it unreachable. There was no negotiation here, no loophole, no second chance. Her brief trespass ended, her stolen days vanished, and with the falling she became nothing again. She returned to the state she had always been in, permanent, final, and undeserving of anything else. The ghost let go. She released the life she had borrowed, the 3 days that had never belonged to her, the warmth she had held as if it could undo 70 years of death. And in that letting go, she became truly, irrevocably nothing, the way she always was meant to be.